Hello and welcome to another episode of Buyout Business and Bourbon. And I'm very, very excited for our guest today. Abby Donnelly is an author, a sought-after speaker, and a coach that has been working with businesses for many years, as well as being an executive at Procter & Gamble. And we're really excited to talk to her about some of her experiences over the last, was it close to 20 years doing consulting, Abby?
25.
25. Wow, that's a lot of business owners you've talked to over the years. So hopefully we get some good, colorful stories, and hopefully our listeners will be able to take advantage of some of your advice that you're hopefully going to be giving us over the next 40 minutes or so. And we're really excited to have you.
Thank you.
Before we get started, Abby, I just want to talk to you about what you do on a day-to-day basis with these business owners and what is the most common thing that they're looking for you to help them with. I'm guessing it's around succession planning because that's really the overall theme today. But what is the number one thing that people are asking for your help with?
Well, I'm actually going to answer that in two different ways. So the number one reason I think people will hire me is because they have a business, they have a successor, and they're looking for some help making the transition between their ownership and leadership of the company and the successor's leadership and potentially ownership as well. But what really is one of the main things that I end up getting involved in is some of the, let's face it, transitions are messy. And so when business owners and their successors are going through this transition, there's a lot of complexity to it. And some of that can get very emotional. And so working through and helping them on, both parties work through this in a way that's productive for both and is really good and sustainable for the business. So both of those, not one.
Right. Now, are you a numbers person as well as an emotional person? That's good. You are, right?
Yep. Probably.
I saw in your background that you have some statistics and probability, experience with numbers and all that. So that's because a lot of what we deal with when we talk to business owners is around numbers and valuation. And I try to cut right to the chase and say, look, it's not just about the number of what your company's worth. We need, if someone's going to buy your company, the elephant in the room is what is your succession plan? Because they're going to look you in the eye and say, you look like you're getting a little up there in age. What is your plan? And it's like, I deal with people that aren't planners all the time, and I'm always wondering, how do you succeed in business if you're not a planner? And a lot of these business owners kick the can down the road, they don't plan, and all of a sudden they look in the mirror and they're in their early 70s, they're like, well, I really need to do something about this business. And I'm like, well, building out a succession plan, as you know, you do it day to day, is not like an overnight venture. You can't solve your problems overnight. And I think that I'm fascinated with the type of work you do because, as you know, when you look at multi-generational family businesses, you're looking at over a period of generations, it's been skipping. And the current generation has this guilt. They don't want to sell to private equity or a strategic, right? They want it to keep going in their family. So is there talented family members? So, what does that look like? How do you, because you must have a lot of difficult conversations where if you're looking at the talent in the next generation and you don't see enough talent, those conversations are probably really tough, but that's what they're paying you for, right?
Well, that's right. And, one of the things that's, I think, particularly challenging is that the business owner who founded the company typically founded it from nothing. They grew it to a level where it's a ongoing, viable, sustainable business. And then the second generation comes in and they may be even younger than the founder was when they founded it. But even if they're, close in age, that next generation is now got to figure out how to take over and run a company that's larger and generally more complex. And today's challenges, I think, in many industries are much more complex than the previous generations had to face. Although, of course, every generation has their own challenges. But they're trying to take over a company that is larger. And I had a situation a couple of years ago that I think speaks to exactly what you were talking about, where the owner had founded the company and built it to a nice size business, in the $20 million range, something like that. And he had the dream of transitioning the company to two key employees that had been with him from the start, and his son, who had joined the company maybe 5 or 6 years earlier. And as we were going through the process of developing those leaders, it became very clear that when they were a $5 million business, the company was the size that those three could run successfully. But as it got to 10 and 15 and eventually $20 million in revenue, the complexity was a little bit outside of what he felt like they were capable of doing. And when I had one-on-one conversations with each of the successors, what I discovered was that his son in particular, he didn't want to run the company, and he didn't know how to tell his father that it wasn't his dream to run this business. And in fact, he joined the company mostly out of support for his father. And so when his father sold the business, he wanted to go too. And one of the interesting, you talked about statistics, one of the interesting statistics that I found is that somewhere around 80% of millennials would rather that their parents, or whether it's an aunt or uncle or something like that, they would rather that the owners sell the company and then they participate in receiving some of the proceeds than they would.
I'm sure they would. It's a lot easier, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. A lot less risk. And then they can go off and do whatever they want, if they even have to work. Like this son that I was just talking about, he thought, I could take a couple of years off. I could spend some time with my family. I could raise my kids and get really, invested in their life. And he really could afford to do that. At some point, he'd have to go back because there wasn't going to be enough cash to sustain him at age 30-something all the way through, his retirement.
Well, what about the next generation? There's a little bit of guilt where the next generation doesn't have the family business. I mean, if it's been been the family for multi-generations, I would think there'd be a level of guilt in selling it to someone, taking the cash, and then the next generation doesn't have much.
Well, I think sometimes there is, but oftentimes, I'm always surprised. Everyone's got their own experience and their own opinion. And so, and then the other question is, are you going to, if you sell the business, you can invest those assets in a way that really does provide for the next generation. And you're not one philosophy is you're not handcuffing the next generation to the business that maybe they don't want anything to do with. And so I rarely hear the next generation feel disappointed that the company was sold. Every once in a while I'll have a conversation, but most of the folks that I've talked to, they understand and they want their parents or grandparents to do what's right for them and for the business instead of either burdening them or putting all their hopes and dreams on their ability to take over the company and run it the way that their previous generations want them to, which is one of the other dynamics that's always interesting is, the next generation may want to run it in a very different way than previous generations, and that can create a lot of friction.
Yeah, and what about the opposite problem, Abby, where the children or child wants to become part of the business and is excited about becoming part of the business, but either they don't have the talent or the leadership traits to do so and take it to the next level or continue it on? I mean, how do those conversations go, and how do the parents? Because most kids, inherently want to please their parents to some degree, right? I think that's probably regular psychology. But how does that go with those kids that don't have the talent? Either you take the time to develop them, or they develop the talent, or
Yeah,
how do you explain that?
It's a great question, and I've seen it play out in a number of different ways. Sometimes the talent is developable, and as long as the owners and the successors are both committed to doing everything in their power to prepare the successor and position them to be able to be successful, that can work out really well. And that's the goal, is to have that opportunity. But I've also seen situations where the successor is not guaranteed a leadership role in the company, but they are given an opportunity to be in the business. And over time, as the business changes, sometimes that evolves into an opportunity for a higher level leadership role because the skill sets do evolve to match up. But sometimes they have a role in the company and they don't necessarily need or want a leadership role. They just want to be a part of the family entity. And so sometimes that can work out really nicely as well. Other times, that we have to have a difficult conversation where we, have to talk through what is the right role for the for the successor. Well, and I'm hard pressed to call them a successor because they're really not going to be taking over the company, but what's the right role for the adult child in the business? And those can be difficult, but what I have found is that oftentimes as the data continues to evolve and you continue to have conversations about what the business needs, which is the most important piece of it, and then what the family members each need out of it, that both parties can come to terms with it. Sometimes it's more devastating to the owners that their son or daughter or niece or nephew isn't in a position to take over, and the younger generation is saying, I'm okay with where we're coming out. So it's not always as devastating as it may seem on the surface.
It seems like too it could get complicated with non-family members becoming, say, the CEO, where someone with the right last name, right, of the ownership has a CFO role, and it's like them working together, and one has equity, one doesn't have equity. Maybe there's some sort of incentives built in for the CEO, but they're not. It's not equity. The family many times doesn't want to give up equity. Sometimes they do, but I'm sure that can get complicated as well.
Well, and I'm sure that you've seen situations where the successor does get into that CEO role, despite all the data that indicates that they're probably not a good fit for that position, and the business struggles. There's a lot in the public sector or in publicly held companies where CEOs transition out. The board selects a new CEO. That CEO is not successful in the role, and the previous CEO will come back in again for a number of years to kind of stabilize the business and then find another successor. I see that happen occasionally in a family-owned business where the parent will leave for some period of time and the son or daughter, niece or nephew struggles a little bit, and the parent does come back in to fulfill a really important leadership role to stabilize it, and then assess whether that successor can be brought in or can take over again under the next set of conditions. So.
Well, I think you and I are both fascinated with this business because all these businesses are different puzzles, and many of them are very complicated puzzles that are kind of fun to try to solve.
Yes.
There's a lot of moving parts because, as you know, we're involved with both the employee ownership, ESOP business, and exits, as well as wealth management, estate planning, charitable giving, and it all kind of fits together. When a business owner is thinking about exiting it, everything comes together, and they kick the can down the road until they can't. At the end of the road, they really need to figure all these different pieces out, and they're kind of interesting puzzles to solve.
Well, and in your situation where you're helping an owner transition the company to an ESOP, from an ownership perspective, that's a fantastic transition. But it does not alleviate the problem that they've got to figure out, which is who's going to run the company. And ESOP, and that's one of the distinctions that I think is really important. And maybe you can speak a little bit to that from your perspective, is there's a huge difference between ownership and leadership. And in a lot of businesses that I work with, those two things get combined in people's minds. And they're important to separate out. And so if you could speak a little bit to that, because I'm sure you see it all the time.
Well, it is true. I mean, there's instances where they'll come to us and they'll say, look, I want to move some shares to my family members, but I also want to take some chips off the table and get some liquidity, because most of my business, I've been reinvesting money, profits into the business, and I don't have so much liquidity on the side. So the only way to solve that is, and as you probably know, you don't have to sell 100% of your company to an ESOP. You could do a partial. So if you do more than 30% sale to the ESOP, you could still elect 1042 and sell your company tax-free, And at the same time, if let's just say, for instance, you sold half your company to an ESOP and got some liquidity, the other 50% you can move shares to other family members because as you know, there's an ESOP, there's a selling to a strategic, selling to private equity, or selling or giving your shares, transferring your shares to other family members. So sometimes you can solve this by doing a partial ESOP, and we did this for a company in California recently that decided to do a partial ESOP, and they're still in growth mode in their 50s and want to move potentially to their kids. And they're not 100% sure yet, but to keep their options open, they only sold part of the company. So I mean
Smart.
I think you're right. It's a great option, and it's a way that you can involve family and get some liquidity. Because if you sell to private equity, as you know, you're going to give up control, and there's going to be earnouts and things like that. But the probability of your family members succeeding in a private equity transaction are probably slim to none because private equity is most concerned with buying it for one price and reselling it potentially in 5 years from then. And what are the probability that the family member is going to be the best person in that key management role? I'm not sure. But, if you want to keep your family in the business, an ESOP where you can keep control of the board is a major factor.
Yeah. And I've seen it work out. There are some private equity firms that have bought minority shares in companies that I've worked with. There are some that have kept the owners on and their successors to run the company under them, and they've done a really good job at that. And then there are certainly some that want to bring in their own leadership team because they have some really strong aspirations that need to be activated quickly.
True. So if let's just play this case study out. I'm the owner. I really want my daughter to run this company. I feel like my great grandfather started this company. I really want my daughter to run the company. I know she's only in her, let's just say, late 20s. She's still gaining skill set. What are the traits you look for when you kind of start talking to her, interviewing her, and trying to develop the skills that she needs to take over the business?
Yeah, so I actually start with you in this scenario. I would start with trying to make sure I learn from you. What do you think that your successor, your daughter, needs to know, show, do, and deliver in order for you to have the confidence that she's ready and for you to be able to allow her to take responsibility? Because one of the dynamics that I see most often that's really dangerous for the business and dangerous for the two parties is if you aren't clear on what you need to see, one of two things will happen. Either you won't see it, or you'll see a little bit of it and then decide that you want to move the goal line. And so you'll keep moving your expectations up so that your successor, your daughter, can never reach them, which is a lesson in frustration for your daughter and for you as well. And so I always start with getting an understanding of what the owner expects from the successor. But it's not just what do you expect to be able to run the company today. We've also got to build a strategic plan and understand if they have a strategic plan, we can use that, but understand what is the business going to need in the future, because the skills that are needed for today's leader may look very different than what's going to be needed 2-3 years down the road, 5 years down the road. And that could be because the business and industry is changing, could be technology is changing. It could be that the strategic plan is changing. I'm in a conversation right now working with an owner who has a successor that has some really creative ideas for growing the company. And I'm not sure whether the owner is going to be on board and supporting that. But if they are, then the skill set's going to look dramatically different than the skill set that the owner has used to drive the business to date.
That's interesting. Okay. What traits do you think are the most important traits for you to look for in somebody that's going to succeed in taking over the business?
Well, I think that's a really difficult question to answer because there are a lot of traits that will serve a company well in one business or industry or characteristics that are different than another. I mean, I think in its simplest terms, the skill sets that I generally look for, and I'm going to define what I think is the role of a CEO as a way of contexting this. I think there are 4 components that are important for a CEO. One is that they've got to have the ability to embrace, if not create, not alone, of course, but lead the process for strategic planning and see a vision for the future of the business. So I think the ability to think strategically and to engage their leadership and their organization in envisioning what a future will look like and strategies to get there is important. I think having an understanding and an ability to be conversant with the numbers, the financials. They don't have to have the skills of a CFO. They can hire resources to do that, but they have to understand the numbers and they have to understand the meaning of the numbers. And so being able to make good decisions with those numbers is very important. The third is they've got to be able to develop not only a strong leadership team, but strong leaders. And so they've got to be the keeper of the culture, and they have to be the person that ensures that the leadership team is continuing to develop. And then the daisy chain, that's what I call the layers underneath, are also being developed by the leadership team. And so they've got this ongoing stream of development that ensures sustainability of the talent in the company. And then the last one is outward facing. So they've got to be the person that has those major outward facing roles. That may mean that if they're in an industry where they're going to be interviewed, or they have a reason to be in a visible place in the community or something like that, that they might do that. They don't have to do that, but they should be expect to play some role there. And then certainly being a face with lawyers or their banker, their CPA, and also in any strategic partnerships or large client situations. They have an issue with a client, that they would be the face that would get involved if things escalate. So I would offer those 4 components as being important. And then the skill sets around it, I think, are going to depend upon what that particular business needs and what the owner feels is necessary for that successor to be skilled at. Because sometimes the owner cares deeply about a particular skill set, independent of whether it's critical for the success of the business.
It's interesting. I don't know, as part of your engagements, do you get involved with recruiting and interviewing some of the key leadership team? Because I would think that it might be difficult to recruit and retain talent to a family-run business if I don't have the same last name as the family members. And I know you worked for Procter & Gamble. As you know, you can, if a finance person at Procter & Gamble, I'm probably issued and rise up the totem pole there. I can get stock options and restricted stock and get incentives. If I work for a family business, it's a salary and maybe a bonus. But unless they're an ESOP where you're getting stock allocations every year, that's one thing. But if you're not, which most companies are not, how do you kind of recruit and retain that type of talent in a family business?
Yeah, I think that's, particularly challenging. And most of the clients that I'm working with, they have a successor identified, or they have a slate of internal candidates that they want to develop, with the expectation that one of those will become an obvious choice to take over for the CEO or the president. If they do decide that they have to step outside for talent, in many cases, I'm happy to participate in the interview process, but I do not do the recruiting. And, my interest is in helping them select the right person. And there's, as you well know, a lot more than just making sure that the skills fit. They have to fit the culture, and they have to fit the long-term plan for the company. But that's a really emotional piece, and it shows up emotionally whether it's an external candidate or an internal candidate, because the owners are always looking to make sure that they're going to leave their baby that they've invested 20, 30, 40 years building and developing. They're going to leave it to somebody that's going to be a good caretaker for it. and is going to be able to take it to the next level. But there's a watch out there because they want them to take it to the next level, but not necessarily that way, or not necessarily, in this way. And so the dynamics, a good bit of where I get involved beyond the development piece, the leadership development piece of it, is helping the owner and the successors kind of work through some of those emotional aspects of it, because it can just get really messy. And then if the owner doesn't have a really clear picture of what they want to do as they begin to ramp down, finding and defining a good role for the owner where they are staying relevant and adding value, but not hampering the successor's ability to lead, it is a very important part of the transition process. So
I would think that's quite a fine line.
it is. It's very tricky. But I think it can be done in a way that both parties can feel really good about the role and the level of engagement. But it can sometimes take some time to work through to that.
It seems like to me sometimes when you interview these owners to talk about their exit plan, which is difficult for many of them to talk about because they don't want to give up their baby like you alluded to. It's legacy. They want to keep the legacy. They want to keep the name. They don't want to sell out to a strategic and have their name change right away. They want to keep control of the company, keep making decisions, and they want someone to take over the business that's going to have their kind of same traits and continue on as they've been continue on and continue to grow.
Yeah. And, sometimes I'll talk to owners very early on in the process where they're not even sure what they want to do with the business. They may or may not have a candidate for succession, and they may or may not want to sell to a third party or an ESOP, and they're really just not sure what they do. And it's interesting, sometimes when I dig a little bit deeper into that conversation and start to surface some of what's really going on there, about half the time I would say that the reason that they haven't taken action towards their own transition, whether it's succession or a sale, is because they just don't know what they want to do in their next chapter. And so there's no rush in those circumstances for them to exit the business. It's much easier for them to stay in a place that feels known to them, feels comfortable. They know how to run the company. They've been doing that for a long time. But when you start to talk about what am I going to do when I don't have this company? What am I going to do when I'm not running this business anymore? That can feel really uncomfortable. And so if I can recognize that that's a part of the process, then I've got a great toolkit and a great process that I use to help owners figure out, it works with executives as well, but most of my clients are owners, figure out what they want to do in their next chapter. And the number one thing that I hear from them when they say, I don't know what I want to do, is that they want their next chapter to be relevant. They want to feel relevant. And so part of it is helping them through the process to see that there's so much that they can do outside of the business that uses the skills and experience that they built over, their lifetime of business ownership in the world, in the community, in other businesses, in ways that speak to them. And so my process helps them go through that, and it starts to shift their identity so that they can see a picture of what life could be like, kind of on the other side, if you will.
Oh, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. So, Abby, when you talk to the owners and then you interview the senior management team, and you realize that the senior management team is not up to snuff as far as, in your view, taking the company to the next level or letting the CEO retire, how do those conversations go with the owner, and then what are the possible solutions?
Well, I think sometimes the conversations are easier than you would think, because sometimes if that's really true and the leadership team is not up to snuff,
they probably know already, right?
They probably know. I mean, whether they want to face it or not is different, but they probably are open to the conversation. And actually, it can be validating to them, because now there's a third party that's kind of coming in objectively, because I don't have any dog in this hunt. And so being able to share with them that, I'm not sure that you've got the team or a leader on that team that's really going to be able to fulfill the role that you need with the goals that you have. And some of it is also about making sure that they're clear on what they want for the business next. And so sometimes it's not as hard a conversation as you think. Sometimes it is difficult, and if it is difficult, I'm not the final say on whether that person. My approach to it is, if the owner feels like they've got candidates that can be successful in it, and I have not seen that in the work that I've done so far, then we're going to reevaluate how we're doing the development. And my job is to double down and do everything in my power to either help those leaders be successful in a way that meets the owner's needs, or help the owner and those leaders ideally. You want them all to come to the same conclusion that this just isn't a fit, or it's not a fit right now. And so then the owner has a decision to make about timing. It could be, well, in 3 years they could be ready, or 5 years they could be ready. Maybe the owner's willing to make that timeline work. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we can go. And, for me, it's all about finding the way that's going to meet the owner's needs and the business needs, which are critically important. You've got so many families that are depending on the business. You've got to make sure that the business is sustainable. And if we start with business need, and then we look at owner need, and then we look at what variables we have to work with, we often can find a way to make it work that I think all parties can get on board with.
That sounds great. It sounds like you're the perfect mix of a therapist, a consultant, a coach. So I think everyone needs someone like you, Abby. It's whether they want to take the time to meet with you all the time and obviously pay you. So speaking of which, how does your engagements work? Because it seems like there's a lot of, there could be a multitude of hours involved, and I'm sure it's hard for you to predict when you meet an engagement. Because I'm guessing that many times you start out trying to solve one problem, and guess what? There's another problem and another problem, and you're the company therapist for everybody. Business therapist, that is, and
That's right.
Possibly other therapists. But, how does your engagement look for a typical company, and, how do you work?
Yeah, so I think it's, as you said, it's going to vary. But what I'm really trying to do is to support the owner and support the successors. And so what I'm looking for is an ongoing relationship with both parties, and it could be more than that. And in a case where there are multiple leaders involved that are going to be candidates for succession, or there's a team of 2 or 3 that are going to lead the company, then I'm typically going to be working with all of those parties and ensuring that not only are they developed, but that the owner is playing the right role in the transition, and that all of the, emotional stuff that comes with all of this has a place of support, and so my job is to make sure that it continues to move forward in a way that supports all those parties. So I'm usually setting up regular meetings with each of those players in the company, and I am I'm working an agenda at every meeting that I have, and I'm always supportive of the whoever I'm meeting with, their agenda, and keep that moving forward until we reach a point where either the successor is ready to take over or a different decision needs to be made. And sometimes I stay all the way through that, and sometimes I stay beyond that. I have a situation right now where I've had the privilege of working with a couple of companies actually where we can go through one succession transition, and then, a few years later, there's going to be another succession transition. And so it's an ongoing stream. And those companies are so forward thinking because they're already anticipating, well, we've gotten through this succession plan, and it's not necessarily a full generation beyond it where there's going to be another successor. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, something like that. And they recognize that they need to keep that succession process moving. And so
What's
smart.
the average amount of time, Abby, that you usually spend with a company? Like, I'm sure that it ranges dramatically, but I mean, is there a typical sweet spot of amount of months that you're going to have an engagement with a company?
I would say more often than not, it goes in the years. It's, maybe 2 or 3 years would be
Okay.
typical, but I don't start that way. I might start with a 6 month engagement and, let's see where that goes. And then if it's working and we're making good progress, and I'm always happy to continue it. My objective is always to add value, and so when I'm adding value, I'm interested in supporting that transition.
Are there sometimes skeptics when you're brought in?
Of course there are, aren't there for you too?
Of course.
Yes.
I would think, especially bringing in we're bringing Abby, psychologist, therapist, consultant.
Well, I am coming at it from a pure business perspective to try to ensure that the business is profitable and sustainable, and that the owner gets their needs met, and that the successor has every opportunity to be successful. And so, to me, if I'm coming in from that perspective, that doesn't mean you're not going to have skeptics, of course. But, my intent is to make sure that all parties win. And I've been doing this a long time. I feel pretty confident that I know how to support the parties to help them win.
Hey, Abby, I know you've written at least a couple books, right?
I
Why
have.
don't you tell us a little bit about your books? Put a
Yeah.
little,
So
ad in.
I'll grab this one is handy. So this is my latest one. This came out in September of 2023. And this really goes through in a lot of detail some of the things that we've talked about today. It's a great book for an owner and a successor read because it gives the 10 principles for this transition. And it walks through what I have found in my work with owners, some of the challenges that they're going to face and how they can work through those productively. And then it also gives the lens on the successor, which sometimes isn't, we hear a lot from owners because they are the owners, but we don't always get to hear the successor side of it. And they bring a lot to the party. And so in this book, I talk a bit about what the successor is going through, which I think needs a voice at the table as well. My other book on succession planning is called Straight Talk About Planning Your Succession, and that's really a primer. It's written specifically for CEOs, and it's about 100 pages, and it gives a nice overview of the succession planning process from my perspective, and takes you through the exit. So both of these books will take an owner through an exit. I've written two other books. One of them is 128 tips. It's a book on leadership tips, and each tip, you can read in about 60 seconds. And if anyone wants to sign up for my newsletter, I send out a tip every week and get a lot of positive feedback on it. And then the last one is the first book that I wrote is a workbook, and it's on networking. So it's called Networking Works. And I have a curriculum that goes with it that I do training. I've done one set of training on Zoom during the pandemic, but most of the time it's in person, local. And it's a really great process for building an ongoing stream of qualified referrals. And that book was run through the Sandler Training Network years ago when I was a Sandler Training partner in a franchise in the High Point area of North Carolina. And so for several years, all the franchisees had access to that. So that was a lot of fun for me.
Oh, that's
Thank you
great.
for asking.
Wow, you've been busy.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
I mean, how do you really answer that question to the owners? Like, I don't know what I'm going to do after the sale and after they really don't need me here anymore because my succession plan is actually working and they really don't need me. Like, how do I find hobbies and
Yeah,
what do
so
I do?
the traditional mindset is that I need hobbies, and for some people that's a great next chapter. Is I love to. If I ask an audience, 99% of the time I will hear the same three answers when I ask the audience, "What do you think people are say that they want to do, and their owners say that they want to do in their
Number one, travel.
travel?"
Number two, not gardening.
Spend more time with family.
Okay. Look at
And-
grandkids. Yeah.
Yep. And number 3, golf. Sometimes I do
Funny.
tennis, but play a lot more golf. And so those are typically the 3 things that I hear. Every once in a while, I hear teach or, consult or something like that. But really, that can be a great thing for a lot of people. But for many, many owners who have spent their career deeply immersed in their business, they're driven, they're entrepreneurial, and a lot of them still have a lot of really good life in them. Even if they're in their mid-70s, they have a lot of good life in them. And so what I do is take them through a process where we uncover, I've got a bunch of tools to do this, but we uncover what are their favorite strengths, because just because they're good at something doesn't mean they want to do it in their next chapter. So what are their favorite strengths? What are their motivators or passions? And those could be what gets them up in the morning, not necessarily a thing, but a feeling or a direction. Like I love to see light bulbs go off in people's mind. Like that's not a hobby, but it points towards some engagement that an owner could do. And then the third one is lifestyle priorities. And so those 3 overlap like a Venn diagram. And the first phase of the process is helping them figure out what that is. And with that in mind, they can then build a narrative to be able to take out into the world and do very strategic networking with their narrative to be able to say, this is who I am at this stage in my life, and these are the kinds of things I love to do and that I'm good at, and I'm looking for the right fit to contribute to an organization or to a company or something like that. And they start to get word out and learn, that these are the kinds of things that could be very interesting to them. And that process is very rewarding because now they build out a portfolio life plan, that's what I call it, where they can do things in part of their life that are so exciting for them, and they still have time and energy to see family and travel and play a lot more golf. So.
Yeah, we had a client that retired and decided to wanted to also play golf, and basically what happened was he called me 6 months later and said, "You know what? I don't like golf that much. I'm going back to work."
Yeah.
And he did, and it wasn't about a financial need. It was more he wasn't happy just playing golf, and he needed a hobby. So it's like finding hobbies is not that easy. It takes some time and effort. So the name of this is Buyouts Business and Bourbon, and bourbon's the lightest note of the topic. So Abby, are you a social drinker, or is there a certain drink you like? What's your favorite?
Oh, well, if you give me an ice cold Stella or a Yingling, I'm pretty happy.
Nice. You are a cheap date. Very
I am
good. I
a
like
cheap
it. I like it.
Yep.
Nothing
How about
wrong
you,
with a
Gerry?
good Stella.
What's yours?
I will go with bourbon. I will go with an Angel's Envy or other. There's plenty of good bourbons out there. In other hobbies you have, Abby? I know you're into dancing. Did I read?
I do love to dance to Motown. Well, I'll dance to a lot of different things, but Motown is my favorite. Yes, thank you. If you put on some good Motown music, it is hard for me to stay in my seat.
Wow. Okay. Little known fact.
Yes, that's
Little
right.
known fact. That's great. Well, Abby, listen, I really enjoyed this. I'm glad you came on. I think that our listeners will really get something from what you had to say, and I think that having somebody with so much experience in this part of the business of the exit is really crucial, and I hope everyone hears this.
Thank you so much for including me, Gerry. I really appreciate it. You're a great interviewer.
Thanks, Abby. Have a great day, and
All right.
we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds great. Thank you. Likewise.